Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know when you are going to be watching these videos. Now, I would like to start by apologizing that I'm not able to join you because I did have a health problem during the Christmas break. Then I was abroad, I'm still abroad, and then doctors told me that I should not travel, at least for another 2 weeks. But hopefully, after these first lectures that I'm going to put on video for you, I will be able to join you in Cambridge. Now, before we start, I would like to mention that every year the paper changes a little bit, and it's important for you to understand how these changes they fit within the main purpose of each part of the paper. Now, in our part of the paper, what we try to do is that we got a set of elements that relate to human well-being, to quality of life. We are going to talk about poverty in the world, inequality in the world, and at the same time, we join with a different set of issues which are related to the environment. So things such as climate change or the poverty environment link or nexus are also part of these discussions, and then we try to see within the same perspective the issue of sustainability. Or the same perspective, I mean, it's not that we don't explore different perspectives, is that we try to bring together different ideas and different dimensions of this nexus of human well-being and ecosystems. Now, but there are new topics, there are new issues that people are talking about. Last year, we introduced the issue of artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence will impact on people's livelihoods. And this year, we are also going to talk about two other issues. The issue of aporophobia, which is a funny word, aporophobia. Probably you haven't heard that before. Aporophobia is rejection of the poor. So what's the link between poverty and aporophobia? So it's very interesting because we start exploring, we start discussing how people's attitudes and ethics might relate to things that actually happen, to facts. Now, the second new issue that we are discussing this year is complementing the issue of aporophobia, is the issue of publicness and the relation between publicness and human development. So attitudes that people have towards this notion of the public or common good, we are going to use different literatures that they address that by using different names and how that impacts on human development. So the first thing that hopefully you have done is that you have entered into Kahoot, you have played the game and you have seen some of the bigger figures for when we talk about development. Some are related to environmental issues, others are related to human well-being issues. And we see them all together when we talk about SDGs, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. So we start our lectures by talking about how these different statistics, they will make sense. So the first thing to have in mind is our sense of reality. When we talk about people without sanitation, when we talk about people without water, when we talk about people without enough calories, even to have a decent life, or people who are the movers in the world, it's important that we understand that even when we discuss climate change issues. So when we bring these issues together, because we do need to put them together to see what's going on, we have to acknowledge that in the world, especially the United Nations, has tried to do that first by using MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which you might have discussed before, but they were created in order to monitor from 1990 to 2050, 7 to 8 main goals in the world, and they were comprised of different indicators. At the same time, we had the SDGs And it's very interesting to talk about how SDGs have replaced MDGs, because to a certain extent, this monitoring, this assessment, which was introduced by MDGs, they have not fulfilled many of the goals that they were expected to be fulfilled by 2015. So when we got to 2012, people started discussing something else to put in place of MDGs. But when you go to that table, and that corresponds to our slide number 3. So when we start the sequence of slides, the first PowerPoint that I'm going to send to you, you will have from MDGs to SDGs. So MDGs are dead, and then we had the new set of SDGs. So when you're going to see some relate to the environment, others relate to poverty, to education, to health aspects. So what are the main differences between the old MDGs and the new SDGs? Now there are two main differences. The first is that indeed SDGs, they have a much broader understanding of ecosystems and the influence of the environment on human well-being. So we'll find more specific goals that are related to environmental aspects, such as things like fisheries. Now, at the same time, we have a much bigger role for companies than we had before. So it's important that we understand that this mixture between bringing more environmental aspects, such as the one for climate or clean water or undersea or life below water, if you prefer, it's important to see how this in itself would only expand the MDGs that we had, but will not change the practical conditions for action. So the fact that companies have been named and asked to participate much more within this new framework also illuminates a strategy of exploring different possibilities. Now, when we go to the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015, what we see is precisely that. It's an invitation for more companies to join, and a much more concrete set of plans. Now, in principle, things are very difficult because they involve a challenge of coordination. Now, trying to understand how these things come together, they are very difficult because there are many possibilities for doing that. But I would like to suggest to you, and then we go towards our next PowerPoint, is that if we did not have any sort or environmental challenge or difficulties ahead, then if we only predict what we got from the Human Development Index about countries' development, well, the trends are good. Now, the Human Development Index, let me explain that to you, is perhaps the most popular indicator we have for development. It has been created by Mabul Haq and Amartya Sen, among others. We are going to talk more about this indicator. And it's a very simple indicator. It's an indicator that includes 3 dimensions considered important for a good life. So we are talking about health, we are talking about knowledge, education, and then we are talking basically about conditions, material conditions for a good life, which quite often will use income per capita. But if we got for all sets of countries these trends, they tend to see positive. Now, over time, there are 2 things for us to pay attention. The first thing is that the trends are positive, but then we have gaps between very high human development countries where people will live a lot, will study a lot, will have a higher income per capita than others, and countries where that is not the case. Yeah, so there's a division there. Now, what is interesting is that all those trends, they're positive. But in case of an environmental challenge scenario, which the first change in that line you can see, that would be 8% lower, and would be lower, even lower, for countries that are less developed in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in the case that the environment is more under stress, that some of these trends you have seen, they push even harder, we would be in the scenario of environmental disaster. And in the case of environmental disaster, then the impact on all countries are going to be felt, but in particular for low, medium, and high human development countries, which means not the very high, would be much, much stronger. So instead of 8, would be 15% lower in an environmental disaster scenario, and the impact would be much higher, above 20% for Sub-Saharan and South Asian countries. Now, at the same time that this happens, we know that there is a trend, there is a long-term trend for reduction of inequality. But under conditions of environmental stress, challenge, and disaster, which is even further, this inequality will simply stop, is expected to decrease. So things they tend to be positive, they tend to be good. So if we only look at human development trends, so the main message behind that is that we would be making a mistake if we only look at the social or the human trends that we can find in these social or human figures. Why? Because there's a very straightforward, there's a very clear interaction between what happens to the environment and what happens to humans' well-being. This is not simply that pollution or contamination of water might affect child mortality in some of these countries. This is much further than that. That affects, as we are going to see in this paper, that might affect people's condition to earn their living. And it's much more complex than that. But the very simple message, not simply by looking at the numbers in a scattered way, but looking in a more systematic way, is that these things interact. So that's the main message. And that affects as well inequality. Why? Because that affects more the poor, more the relatively poor, in comparison to the relatively rich. So we see the trends, and that's our next slide. We see positive trends for reduction in terms of health and education. But we also see that income inequality is worsening. That's a different problem we are going to discuss. Now, but under environmental stress, all these trends, health and education and income, and things related or associated to other aspects to it, such as gender inequality, then they are going to be under stress. Now, if we take into account threats that are more systematic, such as climate change, and you are probably, this next graph that we have, you probably have seen that already, the forecasts in terms of temperature, how they're increasing in the world. So this is it's not new for you, but what you don't know, or you might not know, is that inequality will increase because the poor will be much more affected by these changes. So get just one case. We are predicting that in the case of environmental stress, that the overall decline in precipitation will be more than 4% for low human development countries. But it's not simply that. It's not simply that they will get lower level of rain, but that the variability related to that so comes all at once, and then they spend a long time without it. So the variability will increase as well. So the conditions for the livelihood of these people, and keep in mind that for many of these countries, their economies, they depend a lot on farming. So they are very exposed to weather conditions, will be affected not simply by a lower level of precipitation, but also by a higher variability. And that will affect inequality overall. Now this has many chains, many mechanisms that we can use in order to explain that. But what happens, especially for poorer families, is that when they suffer because they cannot produce or because they have to fetch water walking longer distances, or because they have more difficulties in earning their living, is that children pay a price. And this is very rarely gender neutral. Quite often girls will pay much more than boys do for this case. So that will affect education, that will affect the enrollment and progress of girls more than boys at the same time. We also know that there are many people who depend on forests for subsistence, and there are many people as well who depend on fisheries for earning their living. We are talking here, the numbers sometimes they are so big that we do not appreciate them. But we are talking about 45 million people that fish for their living. So, and that is affected. That we are not simply talking about, well, we are not going to have fish today, we are going to have something else. No, is much more difficult than that, because people are earning their living based on that. So there are strict links also for livelihoods between what will happen to ecosystems and the lives of so many million people. But when we are talking about the HDI, we are talking about education, livelihoods, we are talking about health. And we know that not simply outdoor but indoor air pollution kills a lot, and kills a lot more people in low human development countries. Now, how can we talk specifically about the poor? Well, we can use poverty indicators such as the multidimensional environmental index for ecosystems, but also for poverty. We can bring these multi-dimensions. We are going to talk about how to build this kind of indicators, but we can see multidimensionally both environmental aspects and human aspects. So there are different indexes that can be used. We know that in the world there are many people who are poor, not simply because they do not have enough income, but because they do not have sanitation. Most of the poor, some estimates suggest that up to 80% of poor, they lack adequate sanitation, but also they do not have water. Now, the Human Development Report back in 2006 was on water, and was saying this report that the minimum poverty line for water should be around, well, how many liters per day? How many liters do you think? Now, normally, if I would be in class now, I would stop and I would ask you, how many liters of water do you think you would use every day? And what normally happens, that some people would say, oh, 2 liters, 5 liters, 10 liters. And then one colleague would suggest, wow, 100 liters. And then people look to this colleague suggesting that perhaps is something very strange that he or her would have suggested. But that's normally the case. That's normally the case, that the very poor live with less than 20 liters per day, and that is really not much. That's normally including everything what is needed for survival, and that other people normally people, they would use much more. They would use 150 200 liters per day. So there's a huge inequality in the world in how people are using not simply electricity, which is something that we talk a lot, but how people would use water, as simple as that. Yeah. Now, there are, after this initial discussion, there are some maps. And these maps, I believe that they are very interesting because they suggest how these different constraints, these different environmental constraints, they are spread in the world. So, for instance, let's talk about fragile lands. Fragile lands are those lands that they might have a sort of soil constraint, or either because they have they are in dry lands, or because they had some slopes, or we can have combinations between soils that are difficult for people to live. And we also have places where the main constraint would be fertile lands. They are not dry, but the slope would not allow people to live in a safe place. And you can see in this map that there are many places in yellow and many places in orange as well, and that places which are relatively more developed are places without any form of constraint. Yet, if you go to Africa, we are going to see that soil is the only constraint, and aridity and combinations of aridity and soil constraint practically dominate. And for many different countries that will have 60–70% of their population live in rural areas, this is a real challenge. So it's not simply that people are poor because they do not have jobs. It's that the nature of their jobs would be rural jobs, and that the nature of the environment they have to work on will come with constraints. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. You have the next map is a map that gives a similar information, the rural population on fragile lands. And we can see how they are much more concentrated in terms of density in India, in China, so hopefully you are able to see that in the map, but in many other poor areas in the world one can see that. But that is counterintuitive. You could say, well, if people are living in a piece of land, and if this piece of land is with several restrictions, shouldn't people move away? Isn't what this migration is about? That people simply, when they are not happy, they move to a different country. So over time, things will trend to balance out. Isn't this what happens? Now, what really happens, and the next graph explains that, is when we are talking population living in these kind of areas, there's a strong correlation with poverty. And because people are poor, people tend to have a higher number of children, so their fertility rates are much higher. This means that somehow poverty reproduces itself at a higher speed than other forms of or people, not other forms, but people in different circumstances of population growth. So this is tricky. This is really something for us to think about, because what happens is that over time, people living in these areas, they will increase. So the number of people or the population in these countries will increase. So the problem we have associated with that, which would be poverty, would increase. Now, it's interesting to see how the World Health Organization, so the WHO, would qualify different causes of death. So they have different breakouts by disease, and one would tend to think that the only problem here would be outdoor air pollution. But it's also true that for many of these people living in rural areas in developing countries, they have a strong challenge by indoor air pollution. And this indoor pollution happens because, well, sometimes people don't have gas as you would have, or electricity for your oven or whatever. They have to use different materials, even manure they use sometimes for cooking, and then all sorts of substances, all sorts of pollution and smoke would be inside their houses, which tend to be very small at the same time. So what we can see here is just the distribution of the kind of diseases that they could have. So that goes from lung cancer to strokes, and that comes not simply from outdoor air pollution, but also from indoor air pollution. Now, things are much more dramatic when we consider climate change, sure. So again, a graph that suggests we are going to have a specific discussion about climate change, but this is just business as usual, as you're going to see things about increasing the global average temperature, some pictures as well showing how this thing is happening, and we should pay due attention to that. So that's another aspect that we should not just consider, and we are going to see what are the different mechanisms through which climate change will affect the poor, but we are going to have a specific lecture for that, but I simply wanted to include that. And also we should include concentration of suspended particles. Now you can have in front of you the next graph is the graph of suspended particles, and one can see how there are many black points in India and in China. Now many years ago, a person who was president of Harvard University and a person who was one of the advisors, economic advisors of the President Clinton, suggested that the solution for the US environmental problem was to move away its industries to Asia. And people responded, what are you saying? This is preposterous. So there was a heated debate on that. But, well, in retrospect, that's precisely what happened. So we can see in terms of quality of air, and there are maps, so we can go to the next one, which is the PM10 particles, the concentrations of that. One can see all these reddish and orange particles, that the level of concentration is much higher in China, and well, not simply. So even in Europe, if you look at Spain and other parts of Eastern Europe, that is not terribly pretty, and there are parts of Africa as well, and some parts in the Americas, but one can see how the level of concentration of these particles suggesting the challenge for people for good quality of air is much higher, is precisely in those countries. Now sometimes a picture speaks more than words, and then one can see, when we go to the next topic, the topic of erosion, one can see what happens there. Now I should tell you that many years ago I was involved in a project with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program in Africa, and I traveled to different countries such as Rwanda. And I remember that I could only understand after many different meetings and statistics, and we are talking about how to build poverty environment indicators there, but I could not understand really the issue of erosion when they were saying, look, we have 1,000 hills here, Kigali, the city of 1,000 hills, and we have erosion all over. But I could only understand that when I got my airplane back home, that it was this sort of thing that I saw there, the level of erosion that one would think, well, yeah, it's possible to fix, but the kind of, or the level of money necessary for doing that might not be economically feasible. So that's one challenge, and one can see how this represents actually a very bigger number when we put all these challenges in terms of aridity and slope and poor soil and even some restrictions that affect people related to forests. We are talking about 1.3 billion people suffering this kind of conditions. So this is something that we should not ignore. So let's take stock. Yeah. So the first part of our discussion is just to get the numbers. We get the numbers. So, and we see, look, we have, 800, 900 million people who are starving in the world. We have 2 billion people without proper sanitation. The real numbers are important only for their magnitude, only because of the sense of the problem that they convey to us. And then we try to make sense of these numbers. We try to understand these numbers. So, but how can we make sense of those numbers? In order to do that, we need to engage into a conceptual discussion. We need to talk about what is sustainability. In what sense the main paradigms of sustainability will save the day, will allow us a framework in order to put these things together, such as MDGs have tried and SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are still trying, and they have a framework from 2015 to 2030 to try to make sense of all these things together. These things, they are important to governments. They are important to companies. The corporate social responsibility policies should be able to be aligned with what countries are trying to do as well. Now, sadly, we don't have a nice story here. Sadly, when we talk about sustainability, we officially start with the Brundtland Commission back in 1987. Now, and don't forget, the definition is not that sustainability is a progress that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. No. It's about not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is important because there are different ways in which future generations could develop their abilities to meet their needs. But this seems to be a very nice definition. Okay, we have needs today, we have needs tomorrow, so let's try to keep a balance or on balance these needs. Now the problem is that Brundtland has not defined the concept of needs. What are needs? What do people need to have a life with dignity? So this has not been defined. And there's a second issue which is a problem. Now, one economist called Robert Solow put a challenge many years ago. He said, why should I bother? Why should I bother with people who are going to be born in the future if all these trends, do you remember the trends we discussed before? If all these trends suggest that people in the future, they are going to be richer, they are going to study more, and they are going to live longer than us, than our current generation. Why should we bother with people if the long-term trends, they are all positive? Now, that's a good challenge, and the challenge that we can only solve if we talk about intergenerational ethics. So we have to get into this very messy discussion, such as Nicholas Stern has done to talk about climate change, so we are getting there. But we have to be able to compare today with tomorrow. Now, normally, people would say that today is better than tomorrow. We prefer to have things today better than tomorrow. There's a rate of discount, yeah? I can tell you, wow, do you prefer to have £1,000 today or within next month? You say today. Now, how much do you prefer to have that? Now, if I give you not 100 today, but if I give you 999, would that be okay for you? And probably some of you will say, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine to pay this discount of one to have the money today. But what about if this value is not so small, it's £100 you have to pay in order to receive the money today. You could say, no, prefer to wait. And what about if it is not simply about tomorrow or next month or next year, but is the next 100 years? So even a very small rate of discount for the next 100 years will bring the present value of whatever to a very, very small amount. So these are very important discussions. But the conclusion of this discussion is that somehow the Brundtland report has provided an interesting but very difficult to operationalize definition. But then you can say, well, what about them? Let's go to Rio, 1992, yeah, when they introduced the definition of the 3 pillars of sustainability. Now, you have seen this before, you have discussed this before. The difficulty with this definition is that it's okay that we talk about the economic, the environmental, and the social, but how do we put them together? What about if we have a little more of the economic dimension and we have less of the social and less of the environmental? Is that acceptable? Is that any good? So we do not have an operational metric because we'll have to talk about trade-offs. And then talking about trade-offs means that we have a metric. But we don't, because all these definitions, they have served as very political definitions. So one difficulty here is that there's no way, there's a divide. And this divide is crystallized when we talk about a weak version of sustainability and a strong version of sustainability. They all have to do with how we consider the level of commensurability between different dimensions of sustainability. What is that? What's the definition of commensurability? If you have more of something, or in order to have more of something, you will have less of something else. And then, but what is the rate? Now, within the weak version of sustainability, which normally would be the utilitarian one, we are going to talk about that in the next lecture, but normally would be provided that the overall level of capital increases, there's no problem that we decrease natural capital if that is compensated by any other form of capital. You name it. It can be human capital, it can be physical capital, or any other form of capital that would be considered in our equation. Now, when it goes to strong sustainability, it's a much harder idea, because then natural capital will receive an intrinsic value. If whales do not exist anymore, or if the Amazon does not exist anymore, we are going to be losing something intrinsic, no matter what, no matter whether we'll increase other forms of capital. So it seems that the strong version of sustainability is the one appreciated by conservationists, and it seems that weak version of sustainability is the ones that economists are glad to sponsor. We are going to understand why. But at the very end is this degree in which we accept substitution or the substitutability between different forms of capital that will define whether we are going to be under the umbrella of strong or weak sustainability. So that's one of the challenges. So we are getting almost at the end. I left a quote by Solow, in which Solow disputes that perhaps stronger forms of sustainability, they are not available, they are not sustainable, in the sense they're not feasible simply. So there might be a good idea here, but that no one would have a moral obligation to do things which are not feasible. So, and that's a good discussion for supervision. At the very end, it seems that the ones doing this job would be institutions. So I put a very, very simple, a very straightforward definition of institutions for you. In the next slide, that comes from the World Development Report 2003, so that consolidates a lot coming from institutional economics at that time. in which they are saying, look, what institutions do is that they would pick up signals about needs, about problems. And once they have data together, they will see on balance their different interests. But that would not be enough. What institutions do at the very end is that they will execute solutions. So once they bring together all these different interests, once they are able to weigh the consequences or the implications of these different interests, they will implement solutions. So in strong societies, in societies with a very high level of social capital, where there's no considerable gap between the rich and the poor, so things are more balanced, and then institutions will contribute towards the common good. But in institutions, in countries where there is a gap, a stronger gap in the income distribution, they will reinforce the same privilege that we are able to find out in societies. So institutions are going to be as good as the main conditions within societies. And this is important because we are not going to be able to address all these figures, all these numbers, all these challenges without a proper sense of implementation. Now, I'm breaking this part of the lecture here. I hope this message is clear. Or let me take stock again. So a little bit of water. And let me repeat now the main idea of this lecture. We started with the numbers that hopefully you went to Kahoot, you were able to play with that. The figures itself, they are not important. It's just for you to have a sense of the magnitude of the numbers. So that's the first thing. But how can we bring them together? So I first offered to you the frameworks of MDGs. They do not exist anymore, but they have been transmogrified into SDGs, into Sustainable Development Goals. Now they come together, but they could be a supermarket list, things which are independent, which are not related. So the first thing I try to convey to you is a sense in which things are related, not simply in terms of the forecasts, but how they are related. We are going to have further discussions about that. We are going to see in much more detail in terms of some ecosystems, how we actually find out these links between environmental things and human well-being. And why is this important? Because quite often, good management of ecosystem services is the best way of reducing inequality, increasing education, reducing poverty, increasing overall quality of life for people. So hopefully I have been able to convey that message to you. But should you have any questions after you watch this video, please do write to me. I'm glad to clarify any remaining points, but hopefully we'll have the supervisions for that. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.